No one could have predicted this confluence of events just a few months ago, beginning with COVID-19, the ensuing economic crisis, then the death of George Floyd, and now the seismic street protests driving a sea change in public consciousness. CEOs across the corporate landscape have added their voices to the discussion and are actually determined to use their influence to make lasting change. Corporations are in a unique position and indeed are often expected to address issues of racial injustice and social unrest. For more than 100 years, the Conference Board has helped the world's leading companies and society at large navigate crisis and develop reasoned solutions for our country. We have from our very earliest days advocated for decent working conditions, for the rights of women who were then just entering the workplace, for the rights of people with disabilities in the workplace, and other challenges in creating a fair and respectful workplace for all. So given recent events, we're launching a series of CEO forums to foster action called Building a More Civil and Just Society, featuring CEOs and business leaders from across American industry who will focus on actionable insights to address our societal challenges. Today, we're very fortunate to have Beth Brooke with us. Beth is a recognized voice on corporate reporting and accounting matters and respected by regulators worldwide. She spent 38 years at EY, and as a former tax leader, she concluded her career there as the Global Vice Chair for Public Policy and a member of EY's Global Board. During the Clinton administration, she played roles in the healthcare and Superfund reform efforts and had tax policy responsibility for insurance and managed care. Beth now serves on the public and private boards of eHealth and Sheiks, as well as the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, the Aspen Institute, the Conference Board, Vital Voices, and the International Advisory Council for APCO, the Advisory and Advocacy Communications Consultancy. She chairs audit, strategy, and regulatory committees. She's a global advocate for diversity and inclusion for the LGBT community and women, and was named to Forbes' World's 100 Most Powerful Women 11 times. Beth, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure, Rebecca.
Given your advocacy work for diverse and inclusive workplaces, I'd love your thoughts on where you think we've come and where we still need to go. So, given all the attention to D&I issues in the workplace over the past few decades, have we made real tangible progress?
Well, it's a great question and a frustrating one to some extent, but I think we have. And, when I think back to the global financial crisis, 07, 08, 09, at that time, the business case for diversity and inclusion was not well understood. That's actually when some of the early the inclusiveness research was actually starting to come out. And so, it's taken a decade, but I think that the business case for diversity and inclusion is now very well understood by companies broadly. And that's major progress. That's half the battle, is to understanding the benefits of this and the importance of this. And I think along that time, we've gone on a journey from first just focused on diversity. Do we have the right diverse mix? Then understanding that you've got to get the mix to work well together, the inclusion piece. And then we've gone to an understanding that diversity, getting that mix to work right, doesn't work well unless you have inclusive leaders who know how to make sense out of the chaos and friction of difference in order to get those catalytic and innovative benefits. And so a focus on inclusive leadership. So that's the journey, diversity to inclusion to inclusive leadership. I think a lot of companies have made that progress. I do, though, think a lot of companies are, there's been such a focus on women in particular. And I hear many companies and CEOs say it's women and that and is just one big bucket, but it's right. Women and versus on focusing on the slices, and we're kind of barely in the and as we're witnessing today. So I think in that sense, we're just scratching the surface. We've made progress, to answer your question, but we are deeply unequal. And our economic model is not working socially. And so I think this is just a moment in time to see the issue bigger than we've seen it before.
I think that's right. When you think about this as it's the 30th anniversary of some of the early work that was done for people with disabilities. or you see the recent Supreme Court decisions that are just now beginning to safeguard protections for LGBT workers in the workplace. And you see several of the issues that if we thought perhaps we were on a track to fix from a racial justice perspective many years ago. And yet there are continual challenges that I think get in our way. And I hear what you're saying about inclusive leaders, because I do think that that's at the forefront. Would you consider that as perhaps our biggest challenge to really making additional progress? And what else would you point to as some challenges that we need to address?
Well, inclusive leadership is going to be an issue with us forever. Mastering that is, it's not a human trait. It is some people do come to it more easily, but it's a learned skill. But rather than, the focus on the challenges right now, I actually think we have some great opportunities for progress. And this is, I think, a moment. And I know we have lots of moments, but I think this is a unique moment. I mean, what the pandemic has shown us is that we can accelerate things previously thought impossible, whether it was work from home, the adoption of technology, running virtual conferences as the conference board has done and is doing. We can accelerate our progress. And so we got to think of D&I in that way. The pandemic has also, I think, exposed our corporate heart, the values. And I think it's making companies think deeper about their purpose and think about it in new ways. You think about the pandemic, it started out focused on how are we treating our employees and our workers. Then it started to evolve into how are we treating those in our communities who need help, all of them. And even when we focused on our employees and workers and keeping them safe and treating them well, we started to recognize just how different they are, both in how they live and how they work. And I think that opened up some thinking about and gave us an opportunity to understand differences in a whole new way. I mean, there's essential workers and non-essential workers. Some workers have broadband access, some workers don't. Some have kids at home, some don't. Some have big homes and can work from home. Some have cramped homes and working partners and kids, and it's very difficult. So I think we are sort of laid wide open on the spectrum of differences in how we live and work, which helps create opportunity. It helps us dig a little deeper. And while we're sort of, filleted wide open, we have the murder of George Floyd to come into this moment. And I think what we're seeing is what wasn't being said, but perhaps was being seen. You think about how we each experienced the pandemic. Some experienced it in a very privileged way, sitting comfortably, on the sidelines, safe at home, with tremendous guilt about not being able to do more, while others had no choice but to be out on the front lines, or essential workers. And it was the injustice of the disparities, I think, that is helping to propel the moment to look deeper and to have opportunities. I think what we're seeing, we're having white people of privilege like myself make darn sure we are educated on the systemic issues and the systemic injustices and the disparities. So again, making us dig deeper, go to places that are uncomfortable, because difference is uncomfortable. And we've been on this journey again for the last several decades, but whenever you can get to a place where it is really uncomfortable, you can start to make progress. And I think we're there right now. White leaders, the road has been very well paved for white leaders. And now we're forced to see how it looks on the dirt road, and really own that. So I think the quantity of conversation is beginning. It's also not just in one company, but in all companies and across all stakeholders. So, we saw this in Pride Month with the LGBT community. The LGBT community struggled with how to celebrate Pride. This is not a moment to be celebrating. And the LGBT community went back to its roots of what Pride was at the beginning, which was protests against policing and injustice. And it was led by Black trans people. And so, the intersectionality and the coming together to really focus on the injustice in the Black community has been, I think, got us to a good point, a very good point. But, with the corporate leaders, we historically see statements, we historically see corporations giving money, but all too often we don't see the actions that follow. So what's going to be different now? This is where I think we have an opportunity with ESG and the attention around stakeholder capitalism. There's now a framework to create transparency around actions. So stopping at words won't be good enough. Investors will be able to vote with their money. Proxy advisors, credit rating agencies, it's all transparent now. And so I think we're finally going to have that direct tie of money to the business case. And investors will judge it, and stakeholders will judge it, and that I think is going to make a big difference. All of this coming together at the same time: the pandemic, the social injustice, and an ESG framework that can help put some transparency around it. I think that encourages us to see more opportunities for progress at this moment in time.
Beth, I think that's great advice, and all boards are going to need to take a look at an array of stakeholders and how they manage through this. And your comment around simply giving money, I think, is no longer the right solution. I think there's a lot that can be said for how money goes to support underserved communities, or how to help jumpstart or close some of the gaps. Absolutely. But I think your point is well taken. This is a unique moment and a time for change, and it has to be sustainable. We cannot simply just say, well, the check's been sent, or whatever other stopgap measures might make some sense, and then go back to business as usual. I really don't think that we're at that point in time. So any other advice for boards? I know you sit on several, and I know that you speak with other directors and sort of listening to the kinds of issues and challenges or conversations that are coming up. Do you think that most boards are now so aware of some of these challenges, and perhaps even more importantly, are in touch with the ways in which they need to think about guiding the organization through this time?
Well, it's a really good question. I mean, obviously, there's a lot for corporate leaders and CEOs to do, actually as a management in a company. Mm-hmm. But the boards have a really interesting role, I think, to play. This ESG framework that I mentioned. The board's role in the governance over the E and the S, and the S including the social factors and D&I. The board has a big role to play in challenging. What is the company doing? Are we comfortable with that? Challenging the reporting, the disclosure around it, challenging the makeup of their own board, very simply. What's our own board look like? And if it doesn't look like what we want it to look like when we disclose it, then what are we doing to change it? Term limits, age limits, just a strategy to refresh the board. I have one board I know that they just add a new board member every year, and they sort of have a philosophy of a churn that keeps their board very fresh, very diverse. And they think that's great for the company, and it is. The board's role in succession planning, of challenging management, not just for the CEO, but challenging the succession planning, for the entire leadership team, making sure there are slates in place, making sure they're diverse, making sure they're reviewed every year and transparent at the senior level, but then actually managing the careers of the people on those slates, so that if the person on the slate couldn't step into the role, if the person holding the role got hit by a bus tomorrow, if they're not short-term ready, then what are we doing career-wise to get them the right experiences so that they will be? Otherwise, you get so many diverse candidates that we used to at EY call them slate sitters. They just be on a slate forever, but they never got the job because their career wasn't managed in a way to make them actually really well qualified and seen as a viable candidate. So that's the board's oversight of that, I think, is really important. I think the board's role also is to think beyond just the employees, not just what are we doing for our employees and workers, that's really important, but also what's our corporate purpose? How are we using our corporate platform? Challenging our supply chain. What are we challenging the customers or the vendors in our supply chain to be in terms of diversity and inclusion, whether they're minority owned or whether they exhibit diverse in professional services? Are they delivering to us a diverse team and how they serve us? The board should have their arms around those kinds of principles. I think a Walmart does that very well. They use their platform in that way, and they think about it. With the ESG, the board has to have a clear strategy around it, I think, and tie company performance to it, tie compensation to it. The board should oversee that. And then I guess the last thing for the board to think about, and good practice that I've seen, is they make sure finance is involved with D&I. All too often, the accountability, the targets, the metrics, they fall to D&I versus finance. And having finance actually institute the rigor and the discipline for reporting, for performance evaluation, for tying compensation to the performance evaluation, and using the power of data in D&I, the same way companies use the power of data in all kinds of things right now to enhance and empower the business. So the boards can have a very, very important oversight role right now.
Without question. And I love your emphasis on accountability, because unless you are committed to not just simply creating a diverse slate of candidates, but actually to making a diverse hire, and a diverse hire who is going to be positioned for success, it's the accountability piece. And the rest is, sometimes there's a lot of hand-wringing around what can be done inside an organization. Well, those are the folks who are charged with making sure that people are paid fairly and equitably. Those are the people who are responsible for making sure the diverse candidate slates appear and that the right diverse the right conversations happen so that a diverse candidate is hired. So I love that. I wondered if there's advice you would give to senior leaders. There are many CEOs and senior leaders who are having these conversations right now, and sometimes this is a very daunting undertaking. And I'd be curious to know what advice you might have for a CEO and his or her C-suite in terms of how they personally can lead the change at their organization.
Sometimes I think we overcomplicate this. My answer on that question wouldn't be a lot different today than it was a year ago, in that it is, just as you said, it starts at the top. And nothing changes if it doesn't emanate from the top. So it starts with the CEO leading, engaging, visibly active and engaged, and with clear executable actions. That's what it takes. Then targets and accountability, hold people accountable. What will we accomplish? When will we accomplish it? How will we measure it? And then link compensation to it. That framework is what makes a difference. And if you don't have all those pieces, my experience is very little difference gets made. It's just a lot of words. That is a language business understands, that framework, and it does work. But the new dimensions now with the pandemic and just the need for anti-racism, that is requiring us to go deeper, and it's challenging broadly. Where do we give our philanthropy as a company? Do we do it one and done, or do we do it on a multi-year basis to really help sustain the organizations we're supporting? Do we challenge, as I said before, the diversity of our supply chain and what we're doing with that, and asking the existing supply chains how diverse they are? From our employees and our workers, not just challenging where they're diverse, challenging, as you said, their ratings, challenging the pay equity, and doing the analysis and being willing to look at the answer on pay equity. That's where the data is so critically important. You can't solve that unless you have the data. And being willing to get the data. And in this pandemic, one thing that was frustrating to me is we saw all the early kind of corporate statements, CEO statements, we saw then followed by a lot of philanthropic giving to certain organizations that are doing great work, all needed, all necessary. But I just wanted to scream and go, and some people, like, well, we're going to put a Black person on our board, or we've got a Black person on our management team. And I'm like, why don't you go hire Black workers? And if you can't find the talent you need, then train them. Again, Walmart came out, sort of with a program around that. And I just think at all levels, we have to attack this at all levels. So I would just urge CEOs to be really open. Ford did a 180,000 employee survey just to kind of try to figure out where they were on diversity and views around racism. And I applaud that. The only way we're going to improve is get the data, ask, listen, and learn, and rinse and repeat, and just keep then developing our actions around that. The nice thing is, CEOs with the pandemic aren't on planes all day long. And so they have more of an opportunity to engage with the employees virtually and physically to make sure their engagement is well known. And that's a real opportunity. And they'll need to role model engaging in uncomfortable conversations, whether it's in a group setting or they're just picking up the phone and calling employees and checking in and saying, how are you doing? Help me understand, and then also the nice thing that I've seen is businesses are challenging the nexus of the issues they get involved in from a public policy perspective or a human rights perspective. So perhaps a year ago, they would have said an issue, oh, that just doesn't really affect the core of our business. That's one step removed. That's changing. You see companies getting involved in local policing issues, local issues that they would have defined as outside the nexus of their business previously. Now, because of the pressure from employees and customers and their community, they're being pulled in and having to challenge their purpose in a little bit broader way. Again, considering a little bit broader set of stakeholders. And I think that's just great. And CEOs are willing to engage. But I will say, I've witnessed CEOs engaging deeply, sharing with each other to learn various issues of how each of them are handling the pandemic. You don't see as much sharing on the issues around social justice and diversity and inclusion. And I wish we saw a little more vulnerability and listening and openness and desire on that. That worries me just a little bit.
Yeah, I would hope that those are words that people can hear. Certainly the wind is at their back. If they thought about doing some of these things in the past and didn't feel it was the right time or they didn't have enough support, I think that has shifted. And so my hope is that there really will be the kinds of initiatives that result in lasting change. I don't think we as a country are good at discussing race issues. And so now to do it in the crucible of a hot spotlight and sharp focus makes this even more of a delicate conversation, but they need to be had. Beth, I can't say that we can continue to talk about this for a while, although I wish we could. I have so enjoyed our conversation today, and I thank you for sharing your experiences and insights with us. And it's one thing to raise our voices, but it's the actions that you and other business leaders will take, that boards will take, that will result in lasting change. And I take great comfort in the fact that if we can get enough forward-thinking people to talk about this enough, we really can make real progress in society. Thank you for being with us and for sharing.
My pleasure. And I just hope we watch also for the unintended consequences as we come through this, as we try to reopen and re-engage and watch for the unintended consequences of work from home that, for instance, I've heard companies say there's some of their senior women executives making the decision to stay home because their children won't be going back to school and they're fortunate enough to have a working spouse. So they have the option to not stay engaged. And so there can be unintended consequences that we lose some of the progress that we talked about at the outset of this conversation, that we actually go backwards if we're not vigilant and careful.
No, I think that's exactly right. It is always the unintended consequences that surprise you. I think the thing that we should all keep in mind is that all of us are going to experience not just COVID, not just racial injustice, not just any other thing, any other challenge in society that we need to address. We're going to experience that differently. And we need to be thoughtful about putting a solution together or a series of solutions that work for everyone, because I think equality in the workplace is for everyone, regardless of whichever group is perhaps at the forefront and wherever the impacts are different, the challenges are different, but certainly there are some thoughtful ways in which we can address this. Beth, thank you so much. And it's been a distinct pleasure. And I thank all of the folks who've chosen to listen to this. and encourage them to take a look at the entire CEO Forum series on our website. Thank you again, Beth.
Thanks, Rebecca.